eye instrument. I could not tell whether she was pleased or terrified. They read a name, and then they had to read it again. There was a pause, a delicious little pause. Lan, however, invites reprisal. Word gathered like a storm that will not be satisfied with an ordinary downpour. Commissaire Renaud is not a man to whom such a breach can be permitted. He is of a kind that believes certainty keeps a city from dissolving into violent improvisation. A ledger, for him, is a liturgy of order. To show that the ledger had erred was to reveal seams in civic faith. That night we heard the first knockings at windows, the thin scuff of boots on stair. I slept badly, which is to say I indulged in a half-sleep where every creak was a summons. Renaud's response was surgical. He dispatched men to the offices where lists were kept, to the clerks who had handled paper. He ordered inventories of registers and pressed for evidence of where accounts passed from one hand to another. I had expected a show of forced drills, arrests, and yet there is something more efficient than spectacle, the administrative inquisition. They interrogated small men whose lives had been carved from routine. They found mouths that could be loosened by bread, and the implied kindness of a state that promises safety for cooperation. A clerk I had thought resolute admitted that he had seen a misfile and had been told to overlook it by a superior who feared the responsibility of being precise. Betrayal is domestic in shape. It is not a drama in which heroes are stabbed by dramatic figures, but the polite confession of which stair a man climbs on his way to work. Hortense, who had bled us gossip, and who I had thought of as a rusty, gossiping watch, began to tell a story she had previously kept to herself. Of a night when a man in a hat had slipped into her laundry with a handful of paper. The man had been frightened and had told her to tell no one. They offered me money, she confessed to a municipal agent, her voice small as a child's on a judgment day. They said I would be safe to say I'd not seen those men. But when they came today, they were not gentle, and the clerk looked at me as though I were a ledger he might strike out. Madeleine, whom I had thought to be well practiced in the art of rumor, had friends who were even more practiced. It turned out one of her salon acquaintances had grown careless in speaking of a joke about misread names, a jest taken as an instruction by a man who liked to be remembered by the commissaire's office. It is terrible to see how small talk, like a stray ember, can set administrative tinder alight. Vening came with the sound of doors closing behind men who were not meant to close them. Tiner's shop bore the marks of a being searched, cupboards left ajar, a plate hidden beneath sacks of rag paper. He swore softly when he saw the places they had not reached, the secret drawer in his workbench where the type for our counterfeit lay, the chimney where he had hidden plates and proofs. Someone had bent the stove's ash with a stick as though seeking an errant piece. We counted small losses and we counted larger ones, the refusal of a journeyman to risk his carriage for us. The silence on the part of a clerk who had promised to misfile a register. The city had not only produced a moment of doubt, it had produced an appetite in the state for retribution, and, with it, a new hunger for informers. You do not imagine, when you first begin to practice clandestine arts, how fast fear spreads. It is not the kind of fear that makes a man run. It is a pedagogic fear, a fear that teaches caution by small, persistent examples. Bastien was arrested for a day and released when they could not tie a piece of contraband to his person. He came back thinner, his eyes as if size reduced by having watched too many hands. He told us of an interrogation that had been more about extracting a look than a name, a question designed to make him speak of places where he had seen people with paper. One of our couriers, an older hawker who sold almanacs, was less lucky. He has, I am told, a bruised face and an ache where the handcuffs pressed into the wrist. He promised nothing because he had nothing to promise, but his silence had a price. There are times when the arithmetic of rescues is plain. To save one man you may risk 100. To save 10 you may risk 500. I cannot say that the decision to attempt a larger deception was purely heroic. At the counter of my shop, I had listened to customers whose eyes pleaded for a name to be taken off a list. I had closed my shutters on nights when a voice begged me for a single scrap of paper that might help a brother to pass through a cordon. My choices have always been a calculation of what I can bear to lose. Yet calculation, while it may justify an act to the mind, does not comfort the heart when the consequences fall like pebbles into a pond and the rings reach your door. At the end of that day, while Madeline dithered over a cup of thin wine, and Tyne smoked and pretended the smoke had nothing to do with his shaking, I looked at the ledger of our intentions and found it marked by the kind of annotations I had learned to trust, marginalia that suggested not certainty but a method. We had made a crack in the edifice of the ledger. For a few hours the city had tasted the possibility of names being contested. People thought aloud for the first time that week. They argued softly in boulangeries. A small man in a strip of shadow gestured to a friend as if to say, "Did you see it? Could it be?" But the night arrives in every story where triumph has been tasted, and it asks its own questions. In the half-light of candles we heard of Renaud's orders, inventories to be cross-checked, clerks brought into rooms and asked to produce samples of their handwriting, watchmen's logs to be recited. In the next morning's market some men spoke in flattened voices, better not to linger on talk of lists. The ledger had not been discredited. It had been nicked, and the state had answered with steel and inquiry rather than spectacle. The difference is subtle but killer. The spectacle could be met with a raucous counter-spectacle, but the administrative eye works in counters and misfiles. It is quieter and more enduring. We had done something that might be called noble if one had the taste for such words. We had produced an error that became a gift, a rent in the city's sense of the inevitable. But we had also invited retaliation sharp and bureaucratic. The ledger is not merely a book, it is a system, and systems have ways of attending slight errors with new layers of control. I went to bed that night with the ledger under my pillow, as I sometimes slept with small objects one wants to keep warm. I listened for the sound of boots, and I thought of the people we had saved and of those we had not. I thought of Lucy's bright face in the square and of Bastien's smallness as he slipped the list into a clerk's bundle. I thought of Tyne staring at his type as though it were a wound. We had, for a few hours, created a false dawn, a morning of belief that would not be born through the day. But dawns teach us that light is never a permanent state. It is only a condition that must be renewed. The ledger would learn, as we had learned, to anticipate falsification. And those whose work was to impose meaning on the city would, if they could, mend their ledger's seams with new hands and new rules. The question that lay in my chest like a small stone was whether our crack would be remembered as an aberration or a beginning. I do not pretend to know the answer. The only thing I knew for certain was that we had crossed a line. The line is thin, but once crossed it becomes part of the ground upon which we stand. We had taken a name and, by moving it, taught a city how to question its own voice. As I blew out my candle that night, I could hear the faint, persistent scratch of pens in far offices, the administrative equivalent of a city bracing itself. The ledger resettled its ink into new habits. Somewhere a clerk sighed and began to recopy pages. We had won a moment. The ledger would seek to win back the next. And between those two claims our brief victory and the ledger's patient answer the rest of our life would be written. We had made a dawn that was false in the ledger's eyes but not in the city's. For an instant, people discovered they could breathe differently. I do not say that such breath will suffice against a mechanism designed to kill, but it is a thing to keep. The memory of an hour when something other than fate seemed to determine the course of a life. The ledger would learn, we would learn, and history, which is mostly an accumulation of such learnings, would be the slow and often clumsy judge of whether our deceit was folly or beginning. I slept with the thought of a crowd's laugh. I woke with the sound of a knock. The knock was not the last. The knock would not be the last. And that is where the story bends toward consequence. The knock came in 3 beats, not the staccato of a petty debtor demanding coin, not the soft courtesy of a customer seeking a late pamphlet, but the clockwork cadence of men who had practiced entry. I had been up before dawn. As I always was in those days, the city, not yet awake, beyond the sound of a cart, and the first vendors laying out their bread, and I was at the ledger shelf, tracing the margins of a donation receipt with the thumb that trembled when pressed to old glue. Tiny's shop was on my way, a short walk that took me past a parade of sleeping shutters and the lane where the gutter collected the morning's chill. I had not expected to meet the commissaire by the press that day. I had not expected the world to tilt that suddenly. The press room smells at its barest like trade oil damp wood, the faint sweet of ink warmed where heat meets paper. Tyne had learned to make that smell a comfort, as some learn the smell of their own house, as a place where the furniture bears witness to their private life. When I pushed open his door, I could see the hearth smoke beaded along the high window, the presses quiet but set, a sheet of half-printed paper hanging like an unmade bed. Bastien crouched in an alcove, a packet of leaflets in his fist. Tyne stood by his case, hands at rest, as if he had been waiting for a hand to fall upon them. The sound that followed the boots, the cries, the authority arrived like a tide. Doors slammed elsewhere. Someone shouted a name in the street. Tyne's face did not change its shape. He only moved as if concluding an argument had been having with himself. "Marie," he said, and there was no question in it. "Go back, close your shutters, hide something, anything." He pushed a stack of proofs toward me, a wet insistence in his blue eyes. I stayed. There are things one tells oneself to feel less porous, that the day is cold, that the lint in the window seat must be swept, that a ledger will keep even sunlight at bay. None of those were true in the seconds that followed. Men filled the doorway like ink spilling into a margin. They were not the ragged men of the streets, but a municipal corps, uniforms rumpled by duty, faces hardened by the long business of administering death and order. At their head came a man with a ledger at his hand, that straight, accusing jaw of Lucien Renaud, the commissaire. He had been at other spectacles, at other registrations of fate. He looked like the man who knows the cost of certainty and believes, in his bones, that it is a necessary cruelty. His voice filled the press room. "Search. Every press, every chest, by order of the tribunal." The words were written across the sunlight as if they had been typeset, and the men obeyed them with a pleasing rapidity to his will. Tyne moved as though responding to the pressure of a hand upon his back. He borrowed from me a look too small steel, clinking of iron, and we understood each other without speech. The plates were the heart of his trade, small rectangles of metal, letters raised like tiny islands. They were dangerous and holy. If they survived, one could print again. If they were lost, the ability to counterfeit and to redirect names might be lost with them. He did not speak of ideology then. His hands performed the calculus. He lifted 2 plates, dry and cold, wrapped them carefully in linen, and moved toward the chimney. The chimney looked absurdly inadequate, a narrow throat of brick that led upward and proved its worth every time an errant sooty bird nested in the eaves. Tyne's fingers large, scarred, deft as clockmakers slid plate after plate into the dark. He saw softly between his teeth, a string of names that was more prayer than oath. "Hide them like bones," he whispered, as if the chimney would understand and protect them. Bastien, with the breath of youth, stood ready to carry proofs if asked. Instead, he was shoved back into a corner by a man with a baton. The municipal men moved through the shop with the scissor care of people trained to cut away things that could hurt the common body. Drawers were appended. Type cases were upturned like last week's soup. Proofs caught in the air and fluttered down. Paper, our fragile, argumentative friend, became, for a moment, animated. It lifted and fell again, leaving a trail of inked margins across the plank floor. A clerk in a brown coat barked a question at Teen. Tyne replied with the measured silence of a man who has measured his options and found one secretive enough to be worth a lie. At the threshold stood Jean Morel, his municipal coat still thrown about him, but his face less a mask than a troubled ledger. Jean is not a man who falls readily into drama. He has the patient face of a man who has seen too many mornings end badly, and who keeps his hands clean precisely because he believes that messy hands will have to answer for more. He hesitated at the door, holding a warrant like a buttered sheet that might slip from his fingers. For a moment I could see him weighing the instruction against his memory of Tyne's wrists at the press at dawn and the face of a man who makes pamphlets because he has seen how words can be used to kill and be used to heal. Commissaire Renaud saw the hesitation as if it were a mote in the sun. He turned his ledger upon Jean with the speed of a sharpened quill. "Are you reluctant, Morel? Do your sympathies resist your duty?" His voice had the cold geometry of a man who believes he can subtract affection from obligation. Jean's hand shifted. He filed the warrant improperly under a pile of clamps that Renaud then ordered moved aside. The misfiling could have been accidental. It could have been deliberation so quiet it looked like chance. Either way, it bought a sliver of time. It was only a breath, perhaps no more than the pause between 2 pages. But in that pause, Tyne made his choice, and the chimney kept it. They found proofs many proofs, and they burned what could not be carried away. There is a particular smell to paper set alight. It is not the ordinary acrid of coal, but the intimate aroma of a thing made by hand giving up its voice. The flames licked the edges of a pamphlet of ours and curled its letters to blackness, as if the words themselves were being anesthetized. Men stamped to keep the fire from leaping further. A clerk wrapped his handkerchief about a sheet and tossed it to the hearth, as if to feed the common appetite for certainty. Tyne watched the flames with the face of a man watching a small betrayal happen in slow motion. I should say that the raid was swift. Its planning had been as precise as any of our forgeries. It required informants, a woman in a laundry who remembered a face at a window, a clerk who noticed an odd shipment of paper, Hortense's scared voice telling of a bundle left at a church door. People whisper for reasons as old as hunger, the promise of bread, the promise of safety, the shame of being seen. I cannot name the exact moment one of those small traders of rumor turned to the tribunal. Such matters are not comforting in the telling. Hortense came to me later, her shawl wrapped like a thin coffin. She admitted with a voice that trembled. They asked for names, and I gave what I heard. They promised they would not use it. They said I might be left in peace if I spoke. I have always thought that fear purchases a kind of thin absolution. Arrests were made. A journeyman binder, a man with roughened hands and the stubbornness that marks a worker, was taken in his half-lace boots. He cursed less than I expected, as if surprise had taught him a new submission. Bastien managed to slip out. He was small and quick and had pockets made for leaflets, and the sky seemed to close over him as if it had been waiting for his first mischief. But others were not so fortunate. They were led away with ropes soft around their wrists. I watched their shoulders drop like unpeopled shelves. Commissaire Renaud watched the flames, as if he were brushing his hand over the surface of a ledger and making a final entry. "Order must be maintained," he said to the pressmen when they paused, as if speaking to himself. There is in him a genuine belief that certainty, once established, will prevent further horrors. He believes in the arithmetic of punishment. He believes that names, once pronounced in a ledger, are instruments of civic clarity. We who have learned to name for other reasons, love, grief, the desire to reassign fate, find that argument hollow in the face of a burning shop. Jean Morel lingered after the men were gone, when the embers were swollen and the smoke clawing at the rafters had been beaten into a dull resentment. He did not meet Tyne's eyes. "I filed it wrong," he told me when he thought only I might hear. He placed his thumb on a smudge of soot and rubbed it as if he might erase the day. It was an error. Properly, I would have processed it differently. He said it as if the law itself might be mollified by a small human mistake. I believed him in the manner one believes in weather, not in its intentions but in its effects. We counted losses with the same economy we use when cataloguing a small library. Tyne had saved several plates more than I had dared hope tucked into the chimney like illicit bones. He had not saved everything, a register of names, some proofs of counter lists printed in haste, a set of types that were now warped by heat. The press had been bruised. One platen had a nick that would ruin a fine sheet. A crate of paper had been scorched along its edge. The man who had been taken would not bind any more pamphlets that month. There are debts that cannot be paid in coin. I went back to my shop with my coat still damp from the door, carrying in my head the odor of smoke that clung to the city like an old memory. My hands found their way to a ledger, the same mechanical comfort I turn to when the world has been made sharp by loss. I inventoried what remained, plates safe in chimney, 3 proof copies in Bastien's knapsack, a set of forged margins I had made for a false list now charred at its corner. I wrote their names down as if entering a register at the parish. Plate 1 saved. False list partial. Binder arrested. The act of listing is how one claims the world back. It is a defiant arithmetic. Hortense came to the shop that afternoon like a shadow with a voice. She stood under the eaves and watched me rearrange a row of books, as if the movement might mean we were not changed. She told me what she had told the commissaire in a voice that had given up all attempts at performance. They pressed me, she said simply. They told me that if I remembered other names that I could save myself. So I spoke of a man I thought suspicious, and another who had been seen near Tyne's in the market. I did not think I only wanted to be left in peace. They took what I said, as if it were more important than life. They promised me bread and a clean sheet for my name. Her hands trembled as she spoke. There is a particular sorrow to watching a neighbor unmake herself to appease a machine. The lesson was unhelpful and total. People will barter the lives of others for the small certainty that they will be left. Fear is a currency that buys the illusion of safety. We had thought that withholding knowledge or corrupting it with falsehoods would make the tribunal's ledger uneasy. We had not reckoned enough with the renditions of memory, with people like Hortense whose fears unspooled into betrayals by the thin promise of reprieve. Those are the transactions that break a network from within. That night Tyne sat by his hearth and did not make the jokes he usually makes about typefaces being like people upright serifs and rounded bastards. He catalogued the plates like a man counting teeth and warmed his hands without moving them. We were careless, he said finally, and the words were not apology so much as an inventory. He had always understood the trade as a kind of truce. Typesetting was commerce. Counterfeiting was rebellion for which he accepted a price. Now the price had found a weight I could feel between my ribs. We lit a candle and placed upon the table the plates that had survived. They were small and heavy and cold. Up close the letters seemed to be waiting for instruction, as if their raised faces might protest the fate of their printed words. Tyne fed me a scrap of charred paper he had rescued, the blackened letters still stubbornly legible in places. We read them out loud, a name half formed, an accusation that had burned at its edges. Bastien listened like a boy learning a catechism. The room tightened around him. I thought of the men led away, the binder's fingers used to the smell of paste and thread. The journeyman whose face I had watered with kindness, because booksellers are foolish about the faces of those who work with paper. I catalogued them as losses, but cataloguing is not consolation. It is a way of knowing the enemy's costs. The ledger in the tribunal has its own arithmetic, and we had been taught to expect that any counter-arithmetic would be bloody. There is a narrow consolation. Jean Morel's misfiling, intentional or not, had left us with a chance. The plates in the chimney meant we could print again. We could, with care and cunning, make better counter lists. We could, if we were precise, place names that would divert a procession, that would buy another life, that would unravel a thread in the tribunal's knitted certainty. But each act of recourse would require others to step beyond their fear. Each act would require someone to be more fearful than the man who gives names for bread. I went to bed that night with a ledger beneath my pillow, as I always did, but its weight was more than habit. It carried the names of the arrested, the burnt proofs, the plates hidden in the chimney, Hortense's confession, and Jean's small mercy. When a city is a ledger, each entry is a world. I counted them like beads until sleep came. In the days that followed the discovery of the raid rippled outward. The clients who used Tyner's press for innocent labels came in with small, frightened eyes, as if the next good luck charm would be to speak of nothing. Madeleine's salon sent word in the form of a careful remark: those poor pressmen are so unfortunate, that meant to say both sympathy and warning. Father Benoti offered prayers in private and shelter where he could. Bastien, bless him, kept moving leaflets in an almost ritual way, as if repetition could inoculate us. We were, all of us, rebuilding a life around a hole. The raid had been a lesson. It taught us, with the cruel pedagogy of flame, that material means are fragile. It taught us that people, pressed by hunger and fear, will stake others for crumbs. It taught us that mercy from the interior of the law Jean Morel's slight mercy could exist only as a sliver. It taught us that to print again would require more than forged type. It would require courage from those who had none to spare. We began to plan, not with the arrogant certainty of those who think an idea itself will topple a scaffold, but with the shrewd patience of those who know how to tuck a plate under a floorboard and to teach an apprentice how to fold a leaf into a collar. The plates might be safe for a while. The binder in prison might be spared if we could produce a diversion. Hortense would not be forgiven easily. But the ledger of our lives does not allow for easy absolutions. It requires engagement, weighing of sorrow against necessity. In that arithmetic I learned that the cost of secrecy is sometimes the exposure of someone innocent. The city keeps its own time. It turns the days like pages. The raid had torn some pages out and scorched their edges, but it had not consumed the book. We would mend what we could. We would teach Bastien to run faster and quieter. We would teach Lucy, who was not yet in the hands of the tribunal, the art of moving a list unseen through a crowd. We would ask Tien to make plates in smaller batches, to hide them within joinery, to cut the letters into halves and recombine them to make reprints impossible unless stitched together. We would learn to make our work less legible to the eye of a single raid. And yet, even as plans unfurled, a colder knowledge had entered my chest that names are not only paper, they are practices, expectations, the recorded agreements of a city. To change them is to change how the city moves. The raid had taught me that the tribunal would use fire as it uses a pen. We answered with cunning and secrecy, but I felt the shift as if the ground itself had been jostled. I could not know who would be taken next. I could not know whether the plates hidden like bones would be enough to divert a procession when it came. At the end of that week I lit a candle and took the plates from Tiny's parcel. They were cold and small and unassuming on the table. I ran my thumb along the raised letters and felt the familiar index of a world I could still alter. The knowledge that the press was a machine for both truth and untruth sat between us like a litmus. We talked late into the night about where to print next and who could be trusted. Through the window the street lights drew halos on the wet stones. Somewhere a bell mourned as if the city itself were cataloguing the dead. We had lost people and proofs and an easy confidence. The raid had been a cut and would scar, but scars can be read. They tell the story of what was done and what survived. We put the plates away in the false bottom of an old trunk, and I wrote their names in a private ledger: plate A saved, plate B saved, press damaged, binder detained, The act of recording is not neutral. It is a promise to remember and to act. That night, before sleep took me, I imagined the tribunal,